Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. We have people joining from literally all over the world. So thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Ali Hassan Begi from Global Efficiency Intelligence hosting this webinar. And I have also my colleagues here, the panelists, and also my co-author Adam Sibel here with me. We will be introducing everyone during the meeting. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording the webinar so we can share it later with folks who couldn't make it. And also during the webinar, feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and we will be able to see them. Not everybody can see them, only the panelists, and we will answer them during the Q&A session. Let me share my screen. Okay. So this webinar is for the report that we just published yesterday. The title was "What is Green Steel?" The report was co-authored by me and Adam Sibel from Global Efficiency Intelligence. GEI is a consulting firm based in the US focusing on industrial decarbonization across different industries. And one of the main industries we have been doing quite a bit of work on is the steel industry. And we'll be talking about the report, and we have a great panel lined up that we are going to have a very interesting conversation on this topic. And then we will take some questions. So the report is published and available from our website. This is a more of a qualitative kind of report, unlike some other report and studies that we have done, more like a quantitative analysis. This report is more of a literature review, desktop research kind of work that we did an extensive search to find information related to different standards, protocol, initiatives, and policies, and see how they are defining low carbon steel with regards to different aspects of the standards, initiatives, and policies. I will talk more about that. And this came based on the need we recognized from the work we have been doing with our community. There was a lot of questions around all these different standards. Every few months, we have a new initiatives, a new standards, a new guideline popping up or gets updated. So there was a need to put all this in one place in a more well-structured manner, and that's basically what we did. So in this webinar, I'll give a brief introduction, then a short presentation about the content of this report, and then we will have the panel discussion and Q&A. I will not be going through the detail of the report. There are just 26 different standards, initiatives, and policies we have studied, and I wouldn't even try to get into the detail of that. But at the higher level, we'll basically highlight some of the work we have done and also some of the key takeaways. Just want to very briefly introduce the great panel that we have, and we are going to have the discussion a bit later. We have 6 panelists. We have Stefan Reyes from OECD, Kathy Raymond from Agora, Chris Bataille from Columbia University, Ithram Opelt, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from ND Germany, Lachlan Wright from RMI, and I'll be moderating the panel. I'll let every panelist to introduce themselves properly during the panel discussion, but just briefly in the beginning, wanted to show you the great panel we have lined up and the conversation we are going to have later. So I guess for this audience, you're fairly probably familiar with the steel industry. It's one of the most energy-intensive, carbon-intensive industries in the world. The production has been increasing significantly in the past 2 decades, primarily driven by growth in China. Currently, China accounts for half of the global steel production, a bit more than half. As a result of that, we have significant CO2 emissions from the steel industry. In 2019, we had 3.6 gigaton of CO2 emission from global steel industry. Out of that, around 3.1 gigaton was from primary steel production, primarily using blast furnace basic oxygen furnace, BF-BOF. Around 0.5 gigaton from electric arc furnaces, scrap-based electric arc furnaces. And this 3.6 gigaton basically translated into around 7% of the global greenhouse gas emission and around 11% of global CO2 emission. The first takeaway I would like you to take from this webinar is that steel industry accounts for 11% of global CO2 emission, not 7%. Often I see mistakenly it's presented in different articles that is 7% of global CO2 emission. That is inaccurate. It's 7% of global GHG emission, 11% of global CO2 emission. So it's really staggering. One industry accounts for such a large share of global CO2 emission. Certainly, there's a need for deep decarbonization, moving towards net zero by 2050. And there is a role to play for different standards, initiatives, and policies, and that's what we have looked into. As I mentioned, different standards, protocols, initiatives, and policies can play a significant role to decarbonize the steel sector to be aligned with Paris Agreement target, which is keeping the global temperature rising below or near 1.5 degrees C. However, the current landscape of these standards, initiatives, policy is quite complex, and it's just getting every day more confusing and complex because there's a huge variation in terms of their features, target audience, boundaries, scope, and reporting, verification, etc. All these different metrics within these initiatives and standards that can vary one from another. So what we did, we looked at a total of 26 different, it's a mouthful, I'm going to repeat it quite a bit, a standards, protocol, guideline, initiative, and policy. For simplicity, I may just call it standards, initiative, and policy, but keep in mind, some of these are not the standards, they're just like guidelines that are published. So we looked at 7 standards, protocol, guidelines, we put that in that category, those in that category. We looked at 11 different steel decarbonization initiatives, and I will show you more information about that. And then we also looked at policies, steel decarbonization policies, with a good focus on green public procurement, but also other policies, especially in countries that they do not have a steel green.
You are connected to computer, aren't you?
Sorry, can you mute yourself if you're not speaking? So the policies we looked at was from EU, US, China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Sorry, Canada. I don't know why I said Taiwan. It's another project. We looked at Taiwan. So the report coverage for each of these categories are listed here. Under standards, protocol, and guidelines, we looked at some of the more prominent ones that you probably have come across: responsible steel standard and certification, WRIs, GHG protocol for steel, climate bond initiatives, steel criteria. We looked at 2 ISO standards, carbon footprint of products, and also plant level CO2 emission for steel production. AISI, American Iron and Steel Institute, they fairly recently published the guidelines. We included that, and also RMI Sustainable Steel Principles. There were a few of these, especially, for example, RMI Sustainable Steel Principle and, for example, Horizon Zero Initiative. We couldn't say exclusively they're under protocols and guidelines or initiative. We include kind of under both categories. Just wanted to give that note. For initiatives, we had a larger number of initiatives listed there, and we extracted information and presented in our report. For example, again, Horizon Zero initiatives, World Steel Association, Industrial Deep Decarbonization, IDDI, Science-Based Target, First Movers Coalition, Steel Zero, and etc. Some of the, again, most prominent initiatives that you probably have heard quite a bit. On the policy front, for a few countries and regions, we looked at the green public procurement for steel. Those are EU, United States, California, and Canada, because they do have or going to have Buy Clean, there are a fair amount of activities going on. And then for several other major steel producing countries, namely China, Japan, South Korea, and India, because they don't quite have a steel green public procurement, we looked at national or industry-led initiatives and how they are defining low carbon green steel, etc. So we have presented that in the report. Again, for all of these, we have written 2, 3, sometimes 4 pages in a kind of similar structure and presented quite a bit of information that are listed here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but basically for the standards, initiatives, and policies that I mentioned, we try to extract the indicators, the informations listed here, like how they are defining green low carbon steel, what is the boundary or scope, and whether it's the site level or product level, whether they're using LCA or EPD for that initiatives. Is there a target? And if that target is, for example, aligned with 1.5 degrees C, there are a system of disclosure, reporting, verifications, and etc. So we extracted those for every single of these and explained in the report. And also we tried to do some cross-cutting comparison. So we developed we developed quite an extensive cross-comparison matrix. Don't even try to read the matrix, even in the report, because it has so much information in there. It's quite small, but you can find in the report, zoom the PDF, and you find the content. But basically, in this matrix, we try to compare all these 26 with regards to some of the metrics that are listed here. For example, the steel market focus area of each of these standards or initiatives or policy, whether they're targeting the demand side or the steel producer or the finance, ESG community, or the procurement side. Their boundary and also scope 1, 2, 3, which ones are included, whether there are site or product level initiatives or policy, EPD or LCA are encouraged or required. So with regards to some of these metrics, and also a bunch of them related to their target, we have compared. So a quick look at this matrix will show you the content and the coverage of some of these initiatives and standards and guidelines, which I think will be quite helpful, because quite often we got the question, what are the differences between these, guidelines and initiatives, etc. As I mentioned, one of the items we compared was the system boundaries. As you know, clearly, system boundary is very important when you're accounting for something or measuring something. And when it comes to steel and definition of low carbon steel, calculation of CO2 intensity, the system boundary is one of the most important things. And how you draw that boundary can significantly affect the result. And if the boundaries are very different, then the results are not comparable. It's apple to oranges. So it's an important factor. So out of all these different initiative standards, we found for quite a few of them, the system boundaries as reported by the organizations. This figure, again, don't try to follow the line, otherwise you get lost in the maze, but just illustrative what we did. For 6 standards, guidelines, and initiatives, we basically mapped over their boundary definition and see how they compare. And you can see there are differences, but one key takeaway is, for example, especially for primary steelmaking, around 90% of CO2 emissions are related to the few iron making related processes, namely blast furnace, direct reduction, sintering, and coking. And if you look closely to this upper middle part of this, all of these, at least these 6, they include those iron making processes in their system boundary. So basically for 90% of primary steel making, the coverage more or less is the same. Of course, there are some nuances. Because of lack of time, I can't get into detail of that. But the one key takeaway is, if you want to harmonize further the system boundary, at least across these 6, knowing that for 90% of emissions of the primary steel making, they are covering the same boundary, you probably don't want to spend 90% of your effort for that small portion that there is difference. So there is a lot of talk about the difference in system boundaries. So it's important to identify what actually is the difference. Of course, they are different, but how much that matters. And if it doesn't matter as much, maybe we shouldn't spend that much time and effort and resources. So that's one key takeaway here. And you can find way more detail in the report. So a steel market focus area, that is to say, which side of the value chain these initiatives are or standards are trying to target. We have it sorted by producer only, demand, finance, and ESG only, and then producer and demand together. You can see the largest number of these initiatives and standards, they are covering the producer, a steel production side. For example, responsible steel, WRGSG protocol, World Steel Association, Science-Based Target, and IEA. There are a few, 3 of them that are targeting demand exclusively, IDDI, First Movers Coalition, and Steel Zero. And there are a few that are targeting the finance and ESG community, Climate Bonds Initiative's Steel Criteria, RMI Sustainable Steel Principle, and Climate Action 100+. And there are a few that are targeting both producer and demand, namely MPP's Net Zero Steel Initiatives and Horizon Zero. This is also important because the purpose of these initiatives and the standards, they can influence how they are set up, how their targets are set up, and how their boundaries are set up. So distinguishing between actually their target audience, which part of the steel value chain they are targeting, it's important as well. So not mixing up things that are not really serving the same purpose. So the key areas, in our opinion, based on all this information we collected, which most of it I'm not able to present here, but some of the key areas to focus, in our opinion, to meet the Paris Agreement target are listed here. The first one is a standards, protocol, initiative, guideline, whatever, regardless of what they're serving and how they set up, they should be aligned with the Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees C target. So they might get there different way, but they should be aligned. And there are some of them, quite a few of them, they are not aligned. So that's an issue and a problem. And there is a pathway, for example, net zero pathway for the steel industry to be aligned with 1.5 degrees C, for example, the one that is presented by IEA. So there are studies there that give you a specific CO2 intensity number. So you have to follow in order to be aligned with 1.5 degrees C. The second point is these standards, initiatives, and policy should definitely consider all 3 scope 1, 2, 3 in their boundary, and clearly give the definition and methodology to how to measure them and report them, etc. There are some notes under that with regards to scope 1, 2, 3. When it comes to primary steelmaking, as I mentioned, 90% of emission is really related to a few iron making related processes, coking, sintering, blast furnace, DRI. So we have to make sure those are included for sure, otherwise something big is missing. And for the rest, ideally you want to include everything, but the main ones that account for 90% or plus of emissions should be included. The scope 2 emissions are not included in some of these boundaries. They should be included, and especially for EAF steelmaking, and the share of EAF steelmaking is going to increase. So scope 2 and electricity importance is going to increase. When it comes to scope 3, some of them could be quite minor because steel is a primary material production. It's not something down the value chain. So we don't have much of a scope 3 problem, but there are a few, namely if the plant or company purchasing pig iron or direct reduced iron to produce a steel, definitely that scope 3 should be included in the boundary. The issue of methane emission more recently has got more attention and should be. Natural gas and coal mining basically accounts for substantial methane emission, and both natural gas and especially coal is used extensively in the steel industry. So the inclusion of those in the scope 3 emission for steel industry is also important. Last point is the reliability and public availability of both product and plant level data should be increased to help the basically community to better track the state of progress. However, it should be noted that there is a good amount of data already available. Steel plants and steel companies, they have all the data that we need and data we don't need. So that's given. All the governments in all major steel producing countries, including the developing countries, they have way more data than we need. They collect for different purposes. I've talked to people in our community and they were under question, for example, Chinese government don't have the data for the steel plant. Absolutely, they have. I mean, more than 10 years ago, I've been in a room where the stacks of the detailed energy assessment of steel plants of that province in China was there, and that was more than 10 years ago. They have way more data than we need. However, those data may not be publicly available. So these are two different things. We need to make sure for the purpose of certain policies, programs, or initiatives, how we can get the reliable data that is verifiable. We don't necessarily need everything to be public because of the constraints with confidentiality, etc. So that's also something we wanted to highlight. Okay, I think that's my last slide. So harmonization, alignment, and collaboration. There's a lot of talk about harmonization, and there should be some harmonization for sure activities. But keep in mind, different standards, protocol, initiatives, they are serving sometimes completely different purposes and addressing different segments of the value chain. And the context in which the steel plants and company operate in different countries can be hugely different. You can't really put the same steel plants in US and Europe, same bucket, and the ones in China and India. So as a result, we think it may not be possible and honestly not even practical to assume a single standard would be used or could be used in all countries for all purposes. Some folks, organizations are pushing hard for that and being quite salesy. And we, in the course of this study and other projects we are doing, getting feedback that that is not quite constructive and probably not practical and not going to happen. So what we are suggesting that we need to have a few high quality standards and protocol that try to collaborate more, to align more. They may not align 100%, but to collaborate more, to get aligned more. So that makes life easier for the community. Some aspects of the standards and protocols initiatives for the global harmonization and alignment could be emission accounting boundaries to make sure the main components and processes are included in all of them. Types of greenhouse gas they are covering, and also definition or quantitative threshold that they qualify for a zero emission or near zero emission steel, or so-called clean steel. So these could be some of the areas these standards and initiatives can basically work together to harmonize. Okay, and with that, I would like to thank you. I encourage you to go to our website after this webinar and download the report. Way more information. It's a pretty long report available there. Okay, at this point, I think we can now move to the panel discussion. Let me stop sharing my screen. All right, Adam, if you could help to bring the panelists to the front, but while you're doing that, I'm going to ask them to give a brief introduction. So I'm going to ask the panelists to give like a 1-minute introduction, your name, your affiliation, and very briefly about a work you have been doing recently on the steel industry decarbonization, particularly if it relates to the topic of this webinar. All right, let's start with Ditram.
Yeah, thanks, Ali, and congratulations to the excellent report. So my name is Dieter Moppold. I'm working for the NDE Germany, the National Designated Entity of Germany. This is under the UNFCCC technology mechanism, and we work for the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And also in this function, we support the IDDI, the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative. Yeah, should I explain the IDDI or should we do that later? Or
maybe later when we are talking about the working group too. That would be good. Thank you. Okay, Stefan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, and big kudos to Ali and Adam for a great report. I work for the OECD, as you can see in the background there. I'm heading the team working on steel as well as shipbuilding, serving the OECD Steel Committee that you may be familiar with, which meets twice a year, bringing 200 representatives from governments around the world, but also from steel industry organizations together to talk about different aspects of steelmaking, including policy, of course. And increasingly over the last years, decarbonization has become a priority there. So therefore, whereas we operated in trade, I think for a long time primarily, these days more and more decarbonization is an issue, and hence I'm very pleased to be able to participate in the panel. Ali, so back to you.
Thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. My name is Kathy Reimann. I work as program lead for Agora Industry, which is a think tank focused on decarbonization, transformation of industry, and my work is focused on the steel industry, national or European and also international, partly on scenarios, on technologies, but also since last year on a standard for green steel and some work on that. I also have in the past worked a lot on environmental evaluation, where also standards and standardizations come in. So yeah, so thanks, Ali, for having me here and for asking me to review your great report.
Thank you. Lachlan?
Thanks, Ali, and well done to the team on the report. My name is Lachlan. I work for RMI, which is a non-profit working on the energy transition. I've been working on the technical components for the Sustainable Steel Principles, which was a measuring and disclosure framework for lenders to the steel industry, and also on our Horizon Zero project, which looks at how buyers can support steel decarbonization as well.
Thank you. Chris?
Chris Bataille, currently with Columbia University. I've been working basically on industrial energy efficiency modeling for about 25 years now. The last 7 years been very focused on heavy industries, so steel, cement, chemicals, what have you. Last year, actually it's about a year and a half ago now, I led what's called the Net Zero Steel project, where we took the Global Energy Monitors database of all the major steel facilities globally, and then we applied an algorithm to see how we could turn over those facilities with near zero emissions, and what was available in different regions and what costs, and with a bunch of different scenarios. And we basically found we could do it, but we had to get on the job really rapidly.
Thank you, Chris. Let's actually start with you, Chris. I think given the work you have done, I would like you to ask you more like a high level question with regards to, these different standards and protocols and guidelines. Right. If you could basically characterize what's the key role that they can play in a steel industry decarbonization, because at the end of the day, one would say, it's the steel companies, they need to have the commitment and allocate capital, and decarbonize. So why we have all these different standards and protocols? So can you, basically talk about that. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. First of all, I wanted to say with your second last slide, I was cheering. I want a little toot horn and what have you. I'd even say for the scope 3 method for the gas emissions and the coal methane emissions, I think we need to start bringing that in much more systematically, because it adds actually quite substantially to the emissions, especially for coal, anytime you're using a blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace setup. Okay, so given it's somewhat early here, I made some prepared remarks. I've tailored them to your needs here. First of all, stepping back for a moment here, what are we trying to accomplish with these standards? What is the ultimate objective, and what are the actual direct objectives of them? The overall objective in my mind is to decarbonize steel use from a scope 1, 2, and 3 perspective, which is what you were hitting on, including through demand, design up front, material efficiency, circularity and other recycling, energy efficiency, fuel switching, process changes, and maybe some carbon management. In the end, I would argue we likely need to be heading to a maximum 250 kilograms per ton steel, and ideally 125 kilograms per ton generic steel, including scope 1, 2, 3 by 2050, and credit for facilities that do better than this. This, in my mind, entails that the first big thing we need to encourage is the collection and use of the highest volume possible of scrap at the lowest level of contamination. That is a global resource that we need to take care of going forward. If we allow too much copper into it, it starts to become useless for a lot of different things. We need to push the available quantities and qualities of scrap to their highest end uses. The global market does this to a certain extent, but not including greenhouse gases. To my mind, neutralizing the percentage of scrap does not seem to be a good idea, because it does not incentivize, from the perspective of GHGs, the use of the largest amount of available scrap at the highest available quality. The second thing we need to encourage, and this is the big one because it can overwrite everything else, is the carbonization of primary iron ore reduction. But this is the first one is an organizational logistic issue. The second one is technological and commercialization. So they work in harmony with one another. And a lot of the most advanced facilities today do a combination of secondary and primary together to produce whatever steel product is required in the end. Both these things are non-standard, however, because they tend to add cost. So in one way or the other, the standards are going to be labeling devices such that regulators and potential consumers can identify cleaner steel for subsidization, for lead market premiums, for preferential treatment, for border carbon charges, should we arrive at that in terms of the EU CBAM, the Climate Club that the Americans are proposing. Any usable standards have to be at an easily measurable point, though. For example, at steel facility gates or at a border. Given iron can be reduced at many points in the business supply chain or at facilities, this speaks to focusing on steel and not reduced iron, despite this being where most of the emissions are, as you said. Again, this is just my opinion, my high-level opinion. I'm more than willing to be argued out of it. It does not preclude a separate policy encouraging or mandating with competitiveness adders that all new reduction facilities are near zero emissions. That is the ultimate. By the early 2030s, we should not be building a new reduced iron facility that is not near zero emission. We need to focus on that transformation. Finally, my last point here, bringing this all together, plant gate intensity standards may be key for demand and competitiveness policy. So they're going to be really key going forward the next decade and a half, but they should not be expected to trigger transformation unless they're part of a specific policy package. We can't expect the entire globe to make the full jump to near zero primary reduced iron. That's on the backs of those who can afford it and are technologically able. And then we need to get that technology and the finance to use it in the hands of everyone else. So my final question would be, how can these intensity standards applied at the plant gate of border contribute both to the short-term gradual and the longer-term transformative transition? That's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you had such a short amount of time, but you somehow managed to cover everything. So fortunately, I see the names and a lot of people are familiar with the steel industry. So I think they follow it. Great. Thank you, Chris. So next, I want to basically address questions with respect to different target audience of these standards and initiatives and protocol, and focusing on finance and ESG community, trade, procurement, and some regional aspect of it. So let's start with finance and ESG. Lachlan from RMI, I mean, you have done a fair amount of work, Sustainable Steel Principle, Horizon. So I think you're quite familiar with that aspect. So can you tell us, the importance of this, like how these definitions of green steel, low carbon steel, and different protocols and standards can better help the finance ESG community? And please mention one or two key aspects that the initiatives or standards that are targeting the finance and ESG community should try to harmonize and align to serve that community better. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I can talk a bit mostly to experience putting together the sustainable steel principles. So we worked with a group of 5 banks to try and define how they should measure and disclose the emissions that they finance within the steel sector. And the starting point for that was really to start from a science-based trajectory, right? And get those banks to commit essentially to a 1.5 degree trajectory. And so what we ended up relying on there is primarily the IEA's NZE and also some work done by the Mission Possible Partnership. And then I guess the other real key ask that came from the banks as part of this process and also from the Net Zero Banking Alliance and the other stakeholders that we were involved with there is to make sure that that trajectory can be implemented, right? And how do they engage with their clients in order to do that? And so part of that is why we looked at this kind of differentiating between primary and secondary steel and how we fold that in, how we make sure we get the incentives that we need, both for increasing scrap, as Chris mentioned, but also to drive investments in low carbon primary steel making. And so those were kind of the premise that we started with, and we worked from those trajectories to then break them down then and how that can be applied to a corporate level. I think from a perspective of harmonization, then the next step that is really the main focus for the sustainable steel principles is how do we align these selections? So we selected boundaries, for example, based on those trajectories, however those trajectories were modeled. Can we also align those with what's happening at the product level? And so the Sustainable Steel Principles recently signed an MOU with Responsible Steel to try and do that kind of work, right? To align those boundaries so that we're all talking either at the product or corporate level in sort of the same language. And so I think it's important that these things start to come together. And as Chris said, those methane emissions upstream are really important, but how do we fold that into the trajectory so they can then be used at the corporate level when we do that benchmarking and also at the product level? And so those are kind of the key focus areas as we move forward in that space.
Thank you, Lachlan. You read my mind. I was about to mention the recent MOU with Responsible Steel. Also, I had a personal experience where I was the lead technical expert for developing climate bond initiatives steel criteria. And we had you and Lucy and others from RMI and other folks. And through that collaboration, we ended up for a good chunk of the climate bond initiative steel criteria using the material boundaries and some of the calculation from RMI Sustainable Steel Principle, of course, getting permission. And that's the kind of collaboration we are talking about for alignment. So, I mean, of course, there are differences. We had different purpose for the bond market, but that kind of collaboration and alignment can happen, and we have experienced that. Thank you. Let's go to trade. So, Stefan, I think kind of the same question that I asked, but putting the trade goggle on, and how these standards protocol initiatives that they want, especially they're kind of trying to serve also some of the aspects of trade, the steel trade, could serve better. And from trade perspective, what alignment is more important in your opinion?
Thanks, Ali, for having me again. It's great to be part of this panel. The reward is fantastic. I mean, the table that you made indeed requires some glasses, but I think everybody in this area should hang it above their badge because it's so rich in information. It's really cool. I mean, it's also complex. I worked in many different industries, and I've never experienced a discussion where semantics are perhaps not so precise in the use of the word standards. You try to be very, I think, articulate with standards, protocols, initiatives, and policies. It sounds a bit like Dorothy on the yellow brick perfect road. I mean, tigers and bears and lions. Oh my! I mean, but I mean, what we talk about is we have to agree about what we want to measure. We have to agree about yardsticks on how we want to operate in there. We have a lot of initiatives who trying to push forward these things. I mean, you have governments who also interfere in trying to make this work. I mean, that's the 4 different things that you distinguish there, and I think that that's very useful also for trade, of course, because that's what you asked me. I mean, you don't include trade policies in your policy, whatever column, so to say. I mean, that's something maybe to discuss a bit, because you could argue that there is indeed aspects of standards, protocols, initiatives, whatever, embedded in trade policies as well, or certainly needs to be there. I mean, that's something maybe to take into account. But I mean, it's so important. I mean, maybe trade even more than finance, and I don't want to whatever belittle importance or than procurement, is that if you don't reach agreement on the measurement side and on the normative side on what you want to achieve, the risks are so big in trade, because if we don't advance there, on the one hand, we really might not advance in the global climate agenda, in no matter if it's through carbon leakage or otherwise, and we risk in an area which is explosive in trade policy for decades to create further problems. So this is not, it's not a luxury, eh? This is something that needs to happen. I mean, this is really, I think, essential. And what I think in terms of what needs happening in this domain that you so eloquently map and describe is first, in the trade area, we have a great need for bigger inclusiveness in how we have the conversation. In procurement, we have all kinds of discussions of different parties being together, but in trade, it's happening in Brussels, or in Brussels and the Beltway in DC, where there's incredibly intelligent people working on transatlantic agreements and measurements in trade and aluminium, which is fairly important. But I think that there's a very important need to broaden that conversation from the start, to make sure that when we talk about these definition standards, etc., as you say, that we from scratch do that in a way where other parties are included. Otherwise, we might do something which is maybe academically very articulate, but it just doesn't have the support that this needs for it to work in this global trade environment, which is, I think, a key characteristic of steel. And then the second one, why this is complex, is because the discussion on trade and the standards, protocols, etc., inevitably brings further levels of granularity in there in what you need to do. I mean, you can have, I think, important discussions in procurement at company or facility level, which I think advances well. But on trade, you're immediately pushed in the area: should we do this for every individual steel product, and how does it work out then? I mean, how can we do that? What does it require an administrative capacity? But I think also in the metrics still in how we do that. And you may be aware of what OECD currently is doing in the context of the IFCMA, so the Inclusive Carbon Forum for Carbon Mitigation Approaches, where also in the coming weeks there's going to be further discussions on really working on these metrics in this more inclusive way, which I think is going to be very important for steel as well. Maybe finally, in conclusion, because I quite like also the bit of provocation that you put in the report. Should we go for that holy grail? Is it feasible? Is it desirable? I would say. I mean, that's also something which relates to different aspects of heterogeneity, not in the least perhaps also heterogeneity in different policy objectives, which require different kinds of let's say thresholds, perhaps definitions. But perhaps something that is important in advancing this is that I wouldn't say reculer pour mieux souffler, so not taking a step back because this needs to advance quickly, but that we have to continue taking differentiation of circumstances into account where we move forward. When you focus on uniformity, on harmonization, and maybe I should admit that I spent too much room in Brussels meeting rooms where harmonization was written there, and we all thought that was whatever the best thing that you could do. Sometimes taking difference into account is the best way to advance. So perhaps we should allow ourselves to continue having a look at that heterogeneity aspect, especially if we want to move forward on alignment and agreement on what we want to do together. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Very helpful. Thank you so much. yeah, the difference in context, culture, policy, politics, people often try to forget about that. And I think that plays an important role here. So that's actually a good segue to go to Kathy. I wanted to talk more about the European aspect and the European region or European countries, their work and activities on, the way low carbon green steel is defined and what kind of perhaps protocols or standards are gaining momentum there. But also if you can talk, maybe if possible, link that to CBAM, which technically is trade, but also it's a European thing. And again, how that could link to the topic of, low carbon green steel standards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, strictly speaking, I think there's currently no European country that has actually gotten to the point of defining green steel labeling per se at a national level. There are some countries like the UK or Austria that have introduced green public procurement schemes, which of course work on the assumption of defined green products. And then we see quite a few initiatives in the private sector and also on the international level where European countries are involved, namely IDDI. I'm not going to go into much detail here because I guess that's the next panelist also talking about, but well, the Germany, UK are involved in that, and they have a lot of activities on standardization. And I think that's really a good basis. To me, the result looks like it's going to follow something like the IEA responsible steel approach, maybe with some adaptations. And that's also where some of these private initiatives would come in for me. For instance, Germany, where the German Steel Association has developed an approach that is similar to IEA, but taking it a step further in aiming to include producers of secondary steel better. And that might be a way to maybe take the IEA approach and adapt it to be more inclusive of all steel producers. At the EU level itself, there's a proposal on the new construction products regulation and on eco-design. They would actually open the door to the EU creating its own labeling system and reporting standards, which might not be the way to go because steel is an international commodity, and I think it would be better to focus on international standardization here in some form. But in any case, I'd say the process on the EU level is likely to be too slow anyway, to be honest. So there's a lot going on, and everyone agrees we need something European or even better international. Question to be answered here is probably which platform should we take this on? IDDI might be in a very good situation to do so, and they're already working on it. I would also like to add that we certainly need standards, but in the end, they need to be applied. So we need additional measures. After we define green steel, we also need something like public procurement, maybe also private procurement, setting specific standards in those in order to have to develop and foster green lead markets, and in the end really get green products into the market. So that would be my takeaway from that. Have good standards as a basis. Lots of work on it, but we need to agree on something, and then we need to get into the implementation phase.
Thank you. You actually made a very good point. We are talking about the standards, guidelines here, but what's the point of having a best standard for any of these purposes, but it's not adopted or it's not taken up substantially to really transform the industry in a way that Chris in the beginning said. Like the industry really need to get transformed. We should not be building any new blast furnaces. Like we can't just do that if we want to get to net zero. To do that, I mean, yeah, we have this standard, but if some countries keep going unabated blast furnaces, then what's the point? So adoption absolutely is the key. So next, I want to go to Ditram. So Ditram is the chair of the working group 2 of IDDI, working on standards, and the perfect person to talk about this topic from the procurement angle. IDDI's current focus is on procurement, primarily public procurement. IDDI is led by UNIDO, and we have been also working very closely in the development and now this phase of the IDDI. There are 3 working groups, working group 1 on data, working group 2 on standard, and working group 3 on green procurement. And DITRAM is leading working group 2. So DITRAM, if you could briefly say the work working group 2 is doing in terms of, I believe you're working quite a bit on harmonization part of the standard, and steel is one of the main commodities. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Let me start with, so basically, you know, when we talk about steel, it's one of these hard to abate sectors. So I think it's a different animal than if we compare it to renewables or electric cars, which may be already cheaper than the conventional things. And here we have the barriers to overcome, basically to get the market going. And demand is a very important factor. And here, the public demand, the demand from governments can play a really important role, and that's what we want to address with IDDI. And we have now, I think, so there is nine countries now, and we have developing countries, developed countries. So Germany is there, UK and Sweden from Europe, and then US and Canada, and also developing countries, India, United Arabs, and Saudi Arabia. And I think this is really promising. And what we want to do is basically, we want to create basically this demand for, let's say, green or low carbon and eventually near zero emission steel. And to do this, basically, we have this different level of pledges. So because I think we really have different starting points in different countries. And we have here embarked very much on the maybe responsible steel or IEA methodology, basically, where we have the different bandwidths from low emission steel from A to E. So there are 5 bandwidths we have used here, and then the near zero separate category. Yeah? And basically, what IDDI countries then do, they can choose what kind of level of pledge, commitment they want to do. And the first one is basically to disclose the emissions on the material level, on the product level, on steel. And we focus here on crude steel because that's where most of the emissions are. And we do this on the LCA methodology, on the EPDs, basically, because that covers all the scope 1, 2, 1 and 2 and 3. And then we have to basically agree on the boundaries. Here we want to go, we use this EPDs and harmonized product category rules and so on to arrive at this. And then basically countries can choose if they want to enter at level E or level B or basically eventually go to level C. And IDDI basically wants to have a firm commitment from the countries to commit to only procure low carbon or near zero carbon steel from 2030 and disclose the material level and the project level emissions by 2025, and then basically have an increasing share of net zero emissions, basically where we have to go there. And with this, basically, there can be an important demand driver for basically having this really transformational change from the conventional technologies to all these near zero technologies, basically, which is scrap EAF, hydrogen DRI, or some molten oxide technologies, some new technologies. So basically, this is where we have to go to.
Thank you, Ditram. Yeah, you mentioned a good point that some of these initial commitments are not aggressive, actually the opposite of aggressive. So those targets are pretty not ambitious, but the goal is to get countries signed up comfortable with the program, and over time to, ratchet up the target and make sure more deeper decarbonization will be committed to. Well, thank you so much. I think I might have underestimated the amount of time we need. We have around 18 minutes left, and I want to leave enough time for Q&A. Well, thanks so much to the panelists for your statements and sharing your views. We would like to go to the attendees and take some questions. I don't see that many questions, so probably you were listening very carefully. So please go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, and I will read them to the panelists. If you want to direct it to a specific person, please mention, otherwise I'll make my best judgment. There is a question for Chris. So Chris, the question is, why do you put increasing scrap quality and quantity above shifting primary production? Presumably, both are essential for 1.5 degree target, but what is the GHG saving potential of the two compared? Yeah, that's
well, I don't put scrap ahead of primary iron ore reduction. I think that one is something that we can really work on right away, right? Like, you know, there's a lot of scrap coming available soon, especially in China. Like China is going to go from 10 to 25, probably fairly rapidly, even 40, 50%. How we handle that scrap, that reduced iron, if we don't allow it to corrode back to iron oxide, and B, if we can make use of it in a low contamination way, every bit of scrap precludes what it does is replaces a new amount of primary ore that needs to be. Now the problem is we're starting from near zero with ultra low emissions primary iron. There are there's the Swedish plant. There are a bunch of DRI plants available globally, but we need to, we've got to get this we have to get near zero primary ore production, reduced iron production up to full commercialization. So at least there's 2 or 3 different options depending on the context you're in. Then all the industries that produce this stuff have to scale up to volume. Then we have to make it standard that as every blast furnace comes up for renewal, that they don't get relined, that we build those. So the problem is that's going to take time and effort and focus, right? Whereas we can work on the scrap issue right away. And what you'll notice is a lot of the most modern facilities today don't do just one or the other. They mix in a certain amount of scrap and they'll pre-sort it and they'll try to get out as much of the copper and what have you. And then they'll add just enough new primary iron in to make exactly the steel products that they need. This is becoming standard in North America, right? So often a lot of the steel, like they're getting to the point where they can make thin sheet steel for cars from partially recycled, partially new primary iron, new iron steel, right? So this is a pathway that's open to us with commercial technology today, and that we need to shepherd and I'm looking for a good word that doesn't come out of the Bible. We need to take care of that scrap resource that we have globally so that as we get out towards the end of the century, we don't need a lot of new primary iron. And most of it's coming from scrap, and we're dribbling in just enough new primary iron such that we can make the steel products that we require. That's why I emphasize both pathways. Although if we could somehow, if we could make really cheap new clean primary iron tomorrow, yeah, that would overwrite the problem, and we wouldn't have that problem. The other problem is iron ore supplies are degrading globally. So some of the biggest supplies of iron ore, like they started out at 65% concentration, and they're going down to 62, 60, 58. So the biggest iron ore supplies in the world, specifically in Western Australia, are getting to the point where like we've kind of dug through some of the best known iron ore deposits, and we're going to have to be looking afield and building new mines and getting permitting for that is hard, right? Whereas the scrap has already been dug up and is there to be reused. Okay, I'll stop there, Ali.
Thank you. No, this was pretty comprehensive answer. Another question is, they said this is great content. Any views on how effective these standards and protocol can actually be in driving the change? What makes them more effective over time? It's pretty general, but I want to direct it to you, Lachlan, because you have direct experience with the finance community. How do you think for example, sustainable steel principle is driving change in the finance ESG community, like something that was missing and now you're feeling and now you're observing the change. Can you tell us a little more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of classic example of starting with the measurement and disclosure and that having to then translate into some real action. So what we've been hearing from the banks is that, you know, at least having this framework where they can understand what the trajectory looks like, what they need to do by 2030 and out into mid-century, helps them to start to have a conversation then about what are the options from an individual assets perspective for them to make a change. And so is that increasing the amount of scrap depending on, you know, if you're sitting in a mature market, or if that scrap wouldn't be available if you're in an emerging market, for example, and then, you know, what does the technology landscape look like for that particular plant? And so starting with that measurement and disclosure is by means is only the first step. It has to actually then start to translate into those conversations. And then the whole point of that, right, is to get the capital flowing, because there is a huge amount of capital that we will need, especially on that primary side. And so it's just by getting everybody sort of in the tent and under that framework where sort of we all agree that this is the trajectory we want to achieve, then we can start to kind of move the ball forward into more tangible actions.
Yeah, thank you. The key point is capital flowing to the right place in the right direction, right? Like, as I mentioned, we don't want the capital go to building a new unabated blast furnace. By unabated blast furnace, I mean blast furnace without CCS, which at the moment we don't have any. And honestly, PF with CCS, Chris can talk more about it. It's very hard to get a high capture efficiency. Another thing is, you know, one of the most important thing in my view that our community, as the decarbonization community, should focus on in coming years is to stop and delay relining of blast furnaces until we get a few more years. This hydrogen DRI, and you know, they're built a few, probably in Europe and some other places. People get more confident. Hopefully, the price of hydrogen come down, and then people see that maybe it doesn't make sense to reline the blast furnace, because relining blast furnace actually costs, you know, significant amount. Like, we are talking about billions of dollars, or at least hundreds of millions, depending if it's in China or US. And based on some of the rough data I have, actually it could cost more to reline a blast furnace than building a new DRI plant. So once you reline a blast furnace, that means you are extending the life for another 15, possibly 20 years. So you're locking that capital. So how we can use this standards protocol initiatives to stop that? I think by having requirements to be in line with 1.5 degrees C, and that means a specific, you know, intensity pathway that basically blast furnaces or reline blast furnaces cannot meet. So I think those are some of the missing links that needs to be cleared. And yeah, this community initiative, the standard protocol, if they do the right job, and these companies that are claiming they're joining these initiatives or abiding by this standard, then they cannot go build a new blast furnace or reline the blast furnace. It just would not be in line with the requirements. So that's kind of my additional note on that. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think starting from the trajectories is the best way, right? So if you look at the NZE, even after you kind of maybe apportion it to secondary or primary, you basically cannot meet the primary thresholds in around 2030 with a blast furnace, with an unabated blast furnace at least, right? And so you start to narrow that technology option just inherently by committing to that curve.
Yeah, exactly. So there is another question, I mean, kind of a question, but the science-based target for a steel document is out for public consultation. The deadline is 23rd of January. So anyone here who has time and interested, please go and provide your feedback. I think that would be a good input to our community and SBTi. There is a question about China. By the way, we see, I mean, we do a lot of work in China. As we speak, we are finishing a report on net zero roadmap for China, which we are aiming to publish in mid-February. So stay tuned. But given the time difference, now is, you know, past midnight in China, we couldn't have on the panel. Perhaps we are going to have a separate meeting for our friends in Asia where we do some activities on the steel decarbonization. But the question is saying, how can China be incentivized to reduce their steel industry emissions? I don't know. Stefan, do you want to take that question?
Sure, maybe some reflections. I mean, but don't expect a final answer from me, I hope. So I hope that other colleagues will jump in there. But I mean, China, of course, having this very central role in the global steel production. I mean, in capacity development, perhaps flattening a bit. I mean, with capacity developments now taking place elsewhere, I think that's a significant consideration, of course, in what's taking place. And also from us, from our work at the OECD, underlining that when you look at decarbonization, that's important to look at also in the context of capacity developments and overcapacity, if you want to, because as you, I think, said to yourself before, I mean, if new capacity, green capacity is not going hand in hand with the ending of brown capacity, then we might still end up in a situation where we don't want to be. So that's, I think, a very, very important one. If in how we follow it, there is progress in China, as I think you emphasized yourself as well. There's also a willingness, I think, to some extent, to engage in discussions on the metrics on these kind of things, which is very positive. But like in India, perhaps, I mean, if there is a continued growth in blast furnace kind of steel production, then of course we're not diminishing the problem, but actually making it better. I'll leave it to that, Ali. But yeah.
True. But thank you. Yeah, I mean, China definitely needs to be involved and in many of these initiatives, and even, you know, guidelines and the standards development as much as possible, because not only China, India, you know, Japan, Korea, these 4 countries literally together account for, you know, what's 65% of the steel production in the world. So very important to make sure these are included, especially China and India, in this conversation. And we, from our side, we are working closely with our colleagues there. A question here is, how do we go from definitions of a standard to lead market beyond public procurement and voluntary commitments? So I'm guessing it's saying, how do we go from more like voluntary to more mandatory, regulatory? Kathy, do you want to take that question? At least from European perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good question, obviously. That was my point before, that we need to get there. I don't have a really clear answer yet, just that for me, public procurement would be a starting point. Finding also policy measures to support industry to transform in order to just have availability of green products, and then hopefully also have some more demand measures. Maybe some industries down the supply chain are more willing to actually go for green products because their own consumers are asking for it. But these are things we need to foster and that we need to go for. And also focus on that a lot more, I would say. Right now we're talking a lot about transforming maybe the industry, the heavy industry, but always under the assumption that, at least for the time being, these products are going to be a lot more expensive than the conventionally produced products. And we need to get away from that. We need the renewable energies. We need hydrogen, and we need to lower the costs.
True. Thank you. A clarifying comment came that basically what this person meant is whether only public procurement is enough to transform the industry. And I can quickly answer that no, it's not. Especially for steel. For cement, yes, very large share of cement is purchased for public construction. In US is around 40 to 46%, and many countries is above 30%. But when it comes to steel, is lower share of steel used in public funded construction or public purposes. Depending on the country, like we are doing some study in Japan and Korea is around 10%, 11%, whereas in US is like 20, 25%, in India is a bit higher. So it's big enough to incentivize, but it's in some countries is not big enough to really be transformational. So definitely you need to bring the private procurement aspect, pushing the companies, whether it's the car companies or other companies, to also go for low carbon steel procurement. So that's a good question. One last question. I see two questions. I'm thinking which one to ask this. It's about carbon markets. What's the role of carbon markets that companies can use and monetize, get carbon credit for their steel industry, steel plant or company decarbonization? I guess it relates to finance. Lachlan, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit to that. I would say, from our perspective at the moment, we've been mostly focusing on how to connect buyers and producers, right? Even if you don't trace the whole supply chain, if we think of a model, something like what a PPA is in renewable electricity could still be applied. And so not completely going to a carbon market that is fully fungible, where you take the emissions associated with the steel and package that up and sell that as an avoided emissions saving, but instead making sure that the market is set up in a way that can help connect the actual end consumer who has an incentive to reduce emissions with the producer where most of those emissions are. Like you said in that diagram, 80–90% will sit on one particular site. And so as much as possible that we can establish a direct relationship there, I think that is useful. I think if we get in a discussion of packaging and making it fungible, it becomes much more difficult about how to measure that and prove additionality and progress and things like that. So there is sort of in between steps, I think, that we can take to open the market up and create the right incentives without encountering some of the issues that we see within the carbon markets.
Great. Thank you, Lachlan. And with that, I think we are coming to the end of our time. Well, I would like to thank all the panelists. Great insight you shared with all of us. Thank you so much for attending and contributing. I would like to thank everybody who contributed to this study and everyone who attended this meeting. We had over 200 people signed up, and around half of them showed up, which I think is a success rate. So it shows the great amount of interest in this topic. And I think the community wants to get some more information, some answers. So that's great. So we will continue our work on this. Feel free to reach out if you have questions about this report or other work we are doing on decarbonization, and also reach out to our panelists. They're pretty well known. You can easily find their email. And I would like to thank you and wish you have a good day. Bye, everyone.